Good evening and welcome back to the Kuhn Academy for part 2 of the Constitutional Convention Compromises, Building Responsible Voters one video at a time. All right, so we saw the Virginia plan in our last video and that did not pass because of opposition from the small states. So our next question to ponder here is how many houses exist in a unicameral legislature? And by now you've probably figured out that it is 1. All right, so we need to know bicameral 2, unicameral is 1. All right, so the Virginia plan is defeated. New Jersey plan is then the solution that is proposed by Mr. William Patterson. Okay, and he called for 3 branches of government, and he wanted to give it a little bit more power than the Articles of Confederation had. Okay, however, it was different from the Virginia plan in that all states would have an equal number of representatives in Congress, so it'd be 1 vote per state. All right, 1 vote per state, so that way all states were on a level playing field. This would put New Jersey and Rhode Island just as powerful as New York and Virginia. Congress would have 1 house elected by the state legislatures rather than the people, so there was no direct democracy or even representative democracy here. It would be very indirect. That we, the people, would elect the state legislatures, and then they would just choose who they're going to send to Congress. Part of this actually went into play with the actual Senate we'll talk about in a little bit. So Congress would then choose several people to serve in the executive branch. All right? We kind of take for granted that we only have 1 person in the executive, but they said we're going to have several people to sort of be responsible for enforcing the laws. They figured power in the hand of 1 person would be a little too corrupt, but that they spread it out might be a better check that way. Okay, and then they would appoint people to the judicial branch that way. So this was a little more restrictive and less democratic than the Virginia plan. And by democratic, I mean Democrat with a small d, meaning power to the people. All right, so we're eventually going to solve this problem. Hopefully remember this from U.S. history. Go ahead and pause your videos. Correct answer is Great Compromise, also known as the Connecticut Compromise because it was done by Mr. Roger Sherman of Connecticut. All right, is the one that proposed this one to resolve the differences. All right. Now, in this Great Compromise, there was going to be a House and a Senate. So we want to ask you, what is the primary purpose of the House of Representatives? All right, this is the one that's going to be directly elected by the people and serve 2 terms. All right, so our correct answer is, pause your videos, D, to represent the majority, all right, because this is going to be chosen by the people, all right, elected directly, and as I said before, have a 2-year term, so that way you would be accountable to the people and have to constantly go and ask for your job back, all right, so that was sort of the popular masses would get their will, all right. Jefferson referred to the House and Senate as what was called the cup and the saucer. Okay, that basically the cup is where you have your hot legislation and your emotions going into it, and the majority is kind of being all excited and caught in the moment, and then the saucer is where everything cools down, and that's the Senate's job to cool out the legislation and sort of compromise and bargain with things. All right, so House is going to represent the majority. All right, this is an opinion question. We'll probably get into this in class a little bit on Thursday, but the Constitution's a pro-slavery document. We'll get into that when we look at the compromises. All right, so our first compromise here is the Great Compromise, or Connecticut, which we said was going to determine how many representatives they would have. So the compromise was that we would have a 2-house legislature. We're going to steal that idea from Mr. Madison and the Virginia plan. We're going to go bicameral, and then we're going to have a Senate with equal representation, just like New Jersey wanted, all right, except it's going to be 2 per state. And then we're going to have a representation in the House based on population, okay? And the initial number was 1 vote for every 60,000 people, okay? 1 per 60,000. That happened to be the population of Delaware, the smallest state, so that way the small state would have at least 1 representative in this new House, okay? So that's your Great Compromise. Now, once we solve that one, we have to figure out what we're going to do with the slaves, all right? We should remember this one from U.S. history. Basically, southern states wanted slaves to count in the population. After all, they're people. And northern states felt that they shouldn't because they're not represented. So they came up with a compromise that was actually a number that was arrived at earlier, a couple years earlier, in a compromise about navigation issues and taxation and things like that, and they decided on 3/5. Okay, so 3 out of every 5 African Americans in the South would count in the population. Okay, it's called the 3/5 compromise. All right, so that way Southerners got some representation for them, but not all of them. And this was also for tax purposes. So Southerners were not taxed on all their slaves, nor were all of their slaves represented. Okay, so 3/5. Now the common myth is that the Constitution says blacks are 3/5 of a person. That is not true. It just says for every 5, we're only going to count 3. Okay, in that. But what that does is that introduces slavery into the Constitution. All right. Another question, just to see what we know here. Which of the following is a power unique to the Senate? All right. So go ahead and pause your videos. And our correct answer is to approve treaties made by the president. All right. Remember, the Senate is that saucer. That's where they cool off things, and they're sort of the more older, wiser people that are going to kind of keep the masses in check. So when the president appoints someone or makes a treaty, the Senate has to then approve that before that can become official. All right. So the Senate gets most of those approval powers in the Constitution. All right. Why did Northerners oppose slavery at the convention? We know there was a split there. All right. Go ahead and pause your videos. And the correct answer is C. All right, hopefully you did not pick A. There was really no moral argument about slavery then. It was commonly accepted, but most of your Northerners that were opposed to it knew that for every 5,000 new slaves, that was 3,000 people that was going to count in the population, which is going to make the South have more representatives, which then equals more power. All right, so they felt if we could limit slavery and the counting of the slaves, that would also limit Southern political power, because they were divided on a lot of things, not just the counting of them. All right, a couple more compromises to close up the video here. All right, we have a slave trade and commerce compromise. All right, the plan was that they were going to ban the importation of slaves after 1808. All right, so basically for 20 years, slavery could continue, or slave trade could continue from Africa, and after 1808, no slaves could be imported. All right, and you might say initially, ooh, that's really hurts those Southerners because now they can't import any more slaves. But some of you might remember from U.S. history last year that actually helped the Southerners out, because as long as no slaves can be imported and people still wanted slaves, well, that increased the value of the slaves down in the South. So there actually was an economic incentive for the Northerners or Southerners to agree to that. All right. Then we had a problem on taxes on imports. All right. South was exporters, North was importers. We talked about that feud earlier on. And they came to an agreement that Congress could not tax any exports. And that's still in place today. No goods leaving the country can be taxed, but we can put a tax on imports, which we know to be called a tariff. Okay. So that was going to keep the North happy. And we'll see a feud over that later on in our history with Andrew Jackson. All right. Wrapping things up, the final compromise here is how we're going to select the president. All right. And they were not sure how long the term should be, or if we should even have a president, how he should be selected. But what they decided was that they were going to have an indirect election system, which we know as the Electoral College, and have a 4-year term for the presidency to limit his power and not have a lifetime president like a king. All right, so those are your main compromises of the convention. You'll also be able to read about these in your book. And when we come to class Thursday, we're going to talk here about Mr. Beard's arguments and what our thoughts are on this. So I hope you have a very happy evening, and thank you for listening to this initial installment of the Kuhn Academy, where we are building responsible voters one video at a time.